Okay, so over the next sort of 20 minutes or so, I'm going to just talk a little bit about net zero, a little bit about CCS, and a little bit about COP26, and kind of dash through these sort of topics at a high level to kind of paint that top level picture, which I think hopefully you'll find interesting given your interest as a group of people in CCS. So next slide. So net zero, what is net zero? Well, net zero is set in legislation, originally in 2008, that we would reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 80% by 1990. And in 2019, we committed to raising that to net zero emissions. That's 100% compared to 1990. So 2050 is the key date, committing to net zero. And the way that that's kind of legislated into law, and it's actually quite important in the way that we think about it, is through a series of carbon budgets. The Carbon Budget 4 said what we'll achieve by the midpoint of 2025, Carbon Budget 5 by 2030. And we're just in the middle now of setting Carbon Budget 6. So we're the net zero strategy, which will come out later this autumn, will set the binding government target of what we're looking to deliver for Carbon Budget 6, which is kind of mid-2035 on the whole. That's kind of multiplexed on an international level and relevant for the COP26 around this as something that we call the NDC, the Nationally Determined Contribution. And we've just announced that ours will be set at, I think it's 76%. By 2030, and that's a very, very ambitious NDC, and partly that's through the leadership that we're trying to show at the COP26. So far, so good. Actually, on the whole, Carbon Budgets 4 and 5 are in progress, but actually, Carbon Budget 6, which is the next slide, shows the kind of challenge at 78%, not 76%. So therefore, we've got to reduce 78% by that mid period of Carbon Budget 6, which is 2035. The CCC, which is the Climate Change Committee, which is the independent body that kind of holds government to account over the carbon budgets, said that's you're going to have to require a major investment program, partially as part of the COVID-19 recovery, and it's got to see the following aspects: expansion of low carbon energy, take up of low carbon solutions. That's things like phasing out of cars, potentially gas boilers. We've got to decrease carbon intensity, installation, potentially behavioural change, as well as the land use elements of this. And I'll come back to how the carbon budgets look a little bit later. So how do we achieve net zero? And that's on the next slide. Just to kind of give you a flavour of what it looks like. This is one of the scenarios from the Climate Change Committee. It's in megatons of CO2 equivalent. And what you can see is that there's an important series of measures there running through reducing demand, improving efficiency, as well as low carbon solutions, one of which is CCS or CCUS as part of that, as well as things like low carbon energy, as well as changing land use. And you can see in this scenario, which is it's just a pathway, it's just a way of looking at it. It's called a balanced pathway. You can see the relative amount of the different elements. I think I'm going to talk a lot about low carbon energy because that obviously intersects with CCS, but I wouldn't like to skip over this without saying, actually, it's becoming too obvious to me those top two of demand and efficiency is something that we really should bear down on. We don't have to create this stuff in the first place. Actually, we don't have to decarbonize it, and I think that's going to be quite an important part of this. So how do we achieve those goals? On the next slide, what the government is doing at the moment is put together a whole bunch of plans. The big one was last November, the 10-point plan for the Green Industrial Revolution, stated quite clearly 10 key points of really what we've got to do by 2030 and how we're going to do it by 2030. And that's supported by a whole range of other strategies. Recently, I think was it last week or the week before, the hydrogen strategy came out, which of course is relevant to CCS. We'll pick up a little bit later. Well, previously, we published the Industrial Decarbonisation Strategy, and the Department for Transport has put one out very recently on the decarbonising transport as well. And later this autumn, a strategy that will kind of pull all this together just before COP26 will try and produce an overall net zero strategy for the government. And that looks at the absolute measures, the cost of those measures, and what you need to do in order to achieve net zero. Next slide. I think it's worth remembering, though, when we talk about this transformation, that actually, it's a system problem. And actually, it's kind of worse than that. It's kind of a systems of systems problem. So this is just a systems map for the energy transition, if you will, looking at the three major energy sources in terms of electricity, gas, and oil and petroleum. And on the right side, areas of use, be it transport, be it buildings, be it industry, or the land sector as well. And it's worth noting that they sit in other systems, the financial systems and the funding system for the fair and just equitable transition to net zero. There's also the consumer behavior and behavioural change piece, and we'll come to that a little bit later, the importance of that in the talk. But it also sits not only in the UK context of that, but also the global context of that, which of course is very much we're going to embrace during COP26. And you can see that transition has lots of different bits in it. You can see lots of lines crossing each other. So it's a real systems of systems problem. You've got to understand the system, the energy system in this case, but those systems interact with the financial system, behavioural systems, other systems that are embedded in there. And you've got to understand the interactions of those systems in order to deliver that change to net zero that we saw in the earlier slide. What can conclude from that, which is on the next slide, is that actually it's going to be quite challenging. And I often say this in these sort of talks, that actually to achieve net zero is going to require an economy-wide transformation. And what I've done now is remultiplexed the emissions and negative emissions as well, positive and negative emissions. I said, well, actually, what you can see is we're going to have to decarbonise transport. You can see the pathways to that around EVs and potentially HGVs. We're going to have to decarbonise industry and business, which is about 25% of that, decarbonise our power, decarbonise the way that we heat and cool our buildings, or the way that we build our buildings, which is about 15%, and also the way that we use our land and the emissions that come from farming and agriculture and things like that, as well as potentially towards the end here, and again, where it comes to with CCS, we're going to need negative emission technologies, as they're often called. We're going to need greenhouse gas removal methods as well. And indicatively on the bottom here, I've put some of the goals of the 10-point plan, for instance, 10 megatons of CCS by 2030, 10 megatons per annum at the bottom there. And some of the goals that you're going to have to drive in order to achieve this. So the take-home message: systems is systems problem, and actually that question of economy-wide transformation. How are you going to make that economy-wide transformation? On the next slide, one of the things that we're doing in BEIS, of course, is we run on behalf of the government the Net Zero Innovation Portfolio. That's about $1 billion over the next 4 years. It covers 10 priority areas, which includes greenhouse gas removal technologies as part of that. And this is the relatively high TRL stuff, 4, 5, 6, where it's demonstrator scale through to pilot scale, before it becomes suitable for industrial takeover and use. So that's an important part of what we're doing to drive and make sure this goes on. Next slide. It would be wrong, though, to think that you could solely make this transition by doing it in technological methods or technocratic methods. And the CCC makes the point that you've got to couple this with behavioural change, and it looks at the number of measures and says really 80% of the measures are either wholly behavioural change or largely that, sorry, 59%, sorry, it's those two ones, are largely that. And you could think about that. It's healthier diets, it's changed the way that we design and use products and recycle those products. It's reducing growth in aviation demand, and thinking about the way that our lifestyles change. Next slide. And that's quite a challenge, but you're not going to get economy-wide transformation unless you do that. And you recognize you've got another system challenge here, and there's another systems diagram or a framework to drive that. Digital is actually quite important in this, as well as policy as part of that. So that kind of gives you the top level of net zero, how we're going to change it, and the systems problem. Just going to delve down in the next few slides into the energy transition and what that looks like. If you go to the next slide, this is the total electrical demand, and over the last sort of decade or so, thank you to the Birmingham Energy Institute for that. And what you can see is, just click one down, you should see about I think it's a 16% reduction in 18% reduction, 61 terawatt hours. You see that net efficiency, that net requirement of about 18% of that sort of decade. You'll see the phase out of coal, and you'll see the growth of renewables as part of that. But also what you'll see is the growth of the reliance on gas as part of that. So yes, we're using less. Nuclear is a kind of fixed amount as part of that. Renewables is growing, but we're still reliant on gas. And that really comes to the fore on the next slide. Right, one more. Next slide. This is just the total daily energy demand in the UK. So what you've got here, what you're looking at here, is at the bottom is the electrical demand currently, about a terawatt, 1,000 gigawatt hours, and actually you can see gas there, gas being the balancing amount, but you can see how much it varies, how much we use, obviously very seasonal, depending on how we drive our cooling, but also the liquid fuels that we use. The liquid fuels being the fuels that we use in our motor cars and the like. So what we're thinking about, if you think about the 2050, you think about the change, we've got to make all this energy requirement carbon free or low carbon at least. And you can see that, and you probably guess if you look at many of those technologies, it's going to require a great deal of electrification as part of that. Next slide, please. So actually, if you look at it, it's probably going to require a doubling of electrical generation. And that electrical generation is going to be required to be decarbonized, and also is going to be largely built on renewables. And those renewables are going to put what we call intermittency into the system. So actually, we're going to have to think about the way that we use electricity, growth in the transport and heating, as well as that, and think about how to make that energy transition, that great draw on low carbon electricity for the future. Next slide, please. So that's going to drive some key technologies to drive that energy transition. And I haven't really got time to kind of go through them all today. CCS, or we like to use CCUS, but CCS initially would be good. Is going to be a key technology for that, as is hydrogen. As a low carbon fuel. When I first joined BEIS, everybody talked about low carbon hydrogen. It used to drive me bonkers as a chemist. Of course, it contains no carbon; it's only hydrogen, but it's actually the amount of carbon you expend to make that hydrogen. Of course, is what we're really talking about. Biomass and the role that biomass may play, as well as I've said, the negative emissions technologies. Clearly, and you will all know this. Next slide. You will all know this, that actually CCS plays an important role in that. The department's just announced its cluster sequencing, and we want to get the first of these, as I said early on, of the first of these deployed by the mid-2020s, and a further 2 by 2030. You will know some of the prospective sites for that. And for me, CCS and CCUS is a key enabling technology for that net zero as part of that. Why is it a key enabling technology? On the next slide. Well, if we're to deliver things like the hydrogen strategy, next slide. If we're to deliver things like the hydrogen strategy, it's going to be an important part of that. Low carbon hydrogen is going to need, that's the proportion of hydrogen's total energy consumption going to 2050 under one of our forecasts. So we're going to need, you know, back to that, somewhere in the order of around 250 to 460 terawatt hours of that. And then that is likely to be a twin track, allowing the production of both green hydrogen from electrolysis using renewables as the energy source, as well as CCUS enabled blue hydrogen as well. And that's important, and we can pick up in the questions if you want some of the nuances around, you know, how net zero blue hydrogen is, for example. But CCS is a key enabling technology for us to make blue hydrogen and to get the hydrogen revolution moving quickly over the next period of time. Next slide, please. And the hydrogen strategy, as it says, has got the 10-point plan. It says 5 gigawatts by 2030. The aim, as I said previously, of 4 industrial clusters by 2030, supporting 10 megatons of carbon dioxide per annum, as well as things like using demonstration networks for hydrogen, like Hydrogen for Heat and the Tees Valley Hydrogen Hub. And you can see, you can see the sort of, from the hydrogen strategy, the sort of CO2 storage potential coupled to electrolytic and CCUS enabled production as an important part of that. That's an illustrative example of what we're trying to achieve. Next one, please. So what's the role of science in all this? You know, do I sound too governmental? Hopefully not. The science is absolutely critical for this, and I think it's brought more into focus in a COP year to enable this sort of vision. It's clearly science underpins this. Next slide, please. I think, you know, I'm very much in the space now of science and solutions. You know, in the climate issue, it's you know, we accept the problem now, and really it is actually science that is going to support these sort of solutions. And the president of COP recently said, you know, science is going to be essential for tackling that, and we need a net zero, climate resilient future where we've got science and technology and the solutions for those change. And I'm very, very supportive of that vision and really having to get that. And you can see many different sectors where that science is going to be needed to support that sort of thinking. So science for solutions has got to be the next step in delivering net zero. Next slide. COP26 is coming up in the autumn. Science is absolutely the centre of that. There's going to be a Science and Innovation Day, thinking about how we can deliver that vision around things like the NDCs that I talked about earlier, working also in a global context. Yeah, it's very easy to see this through the UK context, but we've got to see it in a greater part of that. And there's going to be strong international engagement to drive a legacy for the science and technology. And many of you might be involved in things like mission innovation, which is an integral part of the COP process, where we bring together international efforts around particularly the energy transition and thinking about how to enable the international partnerships in order to deliver this. Next slide. So really, what have I hopefully I've convinced you of the last 20 minutes or so? There is a significant challenge. You know, it's economy-wide transformation by net zero, and that challenge is pervasive. There's a requirement for a systems approach in incorporating that behavior change. There's a requirement for a systems approach. It's a systems problem, and we need to incorporate that behavior change. And science is going to be critical to achieving those net zero emissions sustainably, in a sustainable and resilient manner. And that, I think, are the key messages that I would leave you with, and I'm happy to accept any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul. That's great.
Oh, that's my Twitter. If you want to follow me on Twitter, that's my Twitter handle.
Very good. I'm just going to ask a quick question, taking the chair's privilege. The 76% target is very nearly the 80% target that by 2050 that we shifted up from. Do you think there's any danger that in trying to meet the 76% target, we essentially lock in the residual emissions? Because
yeah, I mean,
you can do things that will get you to that sort of level that won't necessarily get you further on to 100% or net zero.
So I think that, so I often talk about resilience and sustainable net zero. And what I often mean by that is you make some choices in the short term that you need to change in the longer term. So, I mean, I think you're kind of hinting at, you know, you end up by having to push the hydrogen economy before we're ready really for green hydrogen, you lock in blue hydrogen, and with that, residual fossil fuel usage. What I would say to you is, if you look at any scenario for 2050, particularly around something like hydrogen, there's still an element of blue hydrogen there. And I think what's amazed me looking at the scenarios hard, virtually all of them contain significant fossil fuel elements, partly because there are elements that you cannot make by any other means currently, though technologically we hope that we will be lubricants, chemical feedstocks, and the like, but you do end up locking in that. So there is a danger. I think there is a danger there that we have to look at, because also, if you know anything, well, you guys do know a lot about the energy system. You lock in actually long-term sunk capital in many of these things as well, in order to get the payback from them. So I think there is a danger that we have to be present on. But the problem is, we really need to get on with this now. And so that's the two kind of counterbalances, if you will. So I think that resilience, and I talk about innovation pathways, and recognizing that it is a pathway and it's not a straight line, that you will maybe have to change that pathway as well.
Yes. No, I guess that, I mean, just you mentioned hydrogen. I think things like the use made of biomass, whether you use it with BECS or use it without, as a lock-in as well. I mean, there's lots of different examples. Okay, so some questions. I guess I'll just say them because we're a bit short of time. But how are ambition and what's considered to be the right sort of energy mix arrived at? How do you decide what's a good ambition or a weak ambition?
Yeah. So this is a really, really good question. So we run an energy model, and actually when we put out the energy white paper last year, we ran something like somewhere between 2,000 or 3,000 different energy scenarios. And actually, kind of what we look, and I must put them in one of my talks, is we have, you know what a Sankey diagram is, which is you look at the energy flows in the system, and then you look at the sensitivity to those energy flows in there, and then you look at the emissions that come from it, the residual emissions you talk about. And what you try then is to minimize, you minimize that. But actually what you have to have, and what you have to have for energy security and resilience, is a number of options, a number of different pathways. So the balanced pathway is one I showed you, but we have the high electrification one, where we think we can achieve more through electrification, and we have a low one. And actually all those scenarios are bounding cases that we can then use to understand that sort of transition, and also understand what there's got to be some techno-realism in this, in some senses as well, about technological deliverability as part of this.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Yeah. Just a quick question from Lindsay Armstrong in Southampton. How much is shipping getting taken into account in CCS consideration?
Right. In CCS, so shipping is really interesting. I mean, partly because it lies in international maritime. It's one of the areas that's been strongly looked at in COP26, because it's one of those terribly international issues. Who owns the emissions when they're offshore? There is an accounting treatment for the emissions of shipping.
Sorry, I mean shipping CO2 from Southampton or South Wales to other clusters.
Okay. Yeah. So. No, I don't think we are. I mean, there's an interesting question about shipping hydrogen from like the Middle East, where solar's cheap. You make the hydrogen a bit like LNG, and you pump it. And I think the interesting question there is, could you ship CO2 back the other way? Mm-hmm. In those empty ships? Interesting question. I've not heard anybody talk about that. So I've not heard anybody talk about. I mean, I think that, Lindsay, I think the kind of thought is we kind of know how to do underground reservoirs from our oil and gas history. Therefore, and this is classical top-level scientists, therefore we must know how to do CCS underground as well.
Okay. And then another question, what about if costs don't go down as fast as we expect?
Yeah, so I think then, yeah.
I guess, sorry, and related to that, costs, and also what about if we run into strategic limits on raw materials?
Right, critical raw materials, absolutely, that's going to be a real challenge, and that's something actually my office is working on at the moment, to have a look at where those flows are for batteries and battery technologies and fuel cells and the like. So that's a real issue in this, as well as electromagnets for wind farms and so on and so forth. So that's definitely part of the understanding. What was part 2 of that question?
Well, just it's related really. What if the costs don't go down?
So I think the costs, I mean,
what if things turn out to be more expensive than we expect?
Of the market forces. Now, what has been quite clear with wind is everybody thought wind wasn't going to be cost effective, and now actually in feed-in tariff terms, it's an absolute raging success. I think the challenge with the CCS area and actually some of the hydrogen stuff as well is carbon pricing and the challenge of carbon pricing. That's why the COP is quite important, to getting that kind of global understanding of carbon pricing. You know, the Mission Innovation wants to get hydrogen to $2 a kilo. You know, and at which point it was what now at the moment green hydrogen $7, $8, $9, $10 a kilo at the moment. So I think there is a question of the technology advancement driving down that price, and it becomes self-evident if you've got the right regulatory and policy tools that you will then deliver the outcomes that you wish. But you've seen subsidies part of the energy system for years. It's getting that in a net zero world right. I'm not suggesting subsidy is the way out of it, but you know, or incentivization, I guess you'd call it, rather than subsidy. Not my area of expertise. That's okay. Economics.
We're running out of time, so I just can't resist asking one question. Net zero by 2050, but a lot of scenarios for 1.5 degrees show us going net negative thereafter. Is that getting any attention at all?
Negative in terms of,
well,
yeah,
the pathways that the IPCC show for 1.5 degrees, just about every one of them gets negative global emissions, net negative global emissions after 2050.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, and I think the challenge there is the problem with some of those scenarios is they peak earlier, above 1.5 degrees before coming back down, and I think one should look at the uncertainty band on those, particularly with respect to that, and you know. It's going to be a challenge anyway. So if we got into that position, actually reducing below 1.5 would have a benefit. You know, every fraction of a degree has benefit to the outcome. So it wouldn't be a bad thing.
Okay, thanks very much, Paul. That's really
my
great.
Pleasure. Thank you for listening and asking. Everybody's asking such good questions.